Hey folks, over the last month or so I've been playing around with this, the Sapphire Pulse RX 5500 XT, lent to me by AMD. So this will come as no surprise to many of you that the RX 5500 XT, or Baby Navi as it's been branded, raised my interest as soon as the rumblings of its existence started to surface. The Baby Navi GPU found in the 5500 XT is exactly what it says it is, a smaller GPU based around the same 7nm RDNA architecture as found on the 5700 series, but coming in at a much lower price point. And it is certainly a smaller GPU, the die size coming in at only 158mm squared, and to put that into perspective, the old 40nm RX 560 has a die size of around 123mm squared. The Polaris 20 GPU found in the RX 570 and 580 range comes in at 232mm squared, and compared to something like Nvidia's 12nm based GTX 1650 non-super, well, even that has a die size of 200mm, while the 1650 Super, which is based on the same GPU as found in the larger 1660 series, has a die size of 284mm squared, over 30mm squared more than even the RX 5700 XT, showing the wonders of the 7nm manufacturing process. This card, it isn't a replacement for the budget-orientated 560 though. No, AMD specifically brands this as a 1080p card, allowing AAA games to run at around 60 FPS. Essentially, this is the card that you will be buying when the stock of Polaris 20 based RX 500 cards finally disappear from the shelves. And that brings us on to the real comparison today. Having a peek over on Overclockers UK, this Sapphire Pulse RX 5500 XT was about 180 quid for the 4GB version that I've got here. For the 8GB version, you're going to pay a £20 premium at £199. On the same site though, you can get a Pulse RX 580 8GB for under £170. On the green side, a decent GTX 1650 is still around 145 quid, so we can completely ignore that since even the 4GB RX 570 will show that card a good clean pair of heels. And the GTX 1650 Super, it's the only sub 200 quid option worth considering, since the stock of the Pascal based GTX 1060 6GB has all but dried up at this point. Now we know that GDDR6 does have a premium attached to it compared to GDDR5, which is what is used on Polaris, and the RX 5500 XT, it really needs that GDDR6 memory. Instead of going with a 256-bit bus like on Polaris, Baby Navi only uses 128 bits, which means that it needs the faster speeds of the 14GB per second GDDR6 to get the bandwidth back up to par with some of the Polaris cards. For example, you've got half the bus width of an RX 570, but it's at double the speed, 14GB compared to 7GB. And that gives the same 224GB per second bandwidth, although this is still below the bandwidth you get on an RX 580. In other areas, the RX 5500 XT has also been streamlined compared to Polaris. We get 22 compute units, meaning a shader count of 1408, along with 88 TMUs, compared to the 32 and 36 compute unit layout of the 570 and 580 respectively. The RX 5500 XT, however, it does keep the same 32 ROPs, and it sees a massive bump up in clock speed. A good RX 580 could maybe tickle 1400 MHz with an overclock. While testing the RX 5500 XT, it settled in at over 1800 MHz during gaming, and that's out of the box, and it can be pushed closer to 2 GHz depending on your individual card and how much you want to tinker with it. And that is of course before we even consider the massive bump up in per core performance of RDNA compared to GCN. The reality of the RX 5500 XT then is that it is basically a direct replacement for the 580. So to see how it stacks up, I've built what is essentially a decent budget gaming system with a mix of old and new parts and a target price of around 500 quid. It's the same machine I built recently for the GameMax Venus case review, and you can check that video out in the corner. The bottom line here is 8 cores, 16 threads thanks to its Ryzen 7 1700 CPU, a B450 motherboard, and 16GB of DDR4 memory running at 3000 MHz. Out of the box, the 1700 will boost 2 cores to its max speed of 3.7 GHz and up to 3.1 GHz when all 8 cores are being hammered, and it's in this base configuration that everything was first tested. All games here were tested at 1920 by 1080 resolution using DX12 where available and high settings unless otherwise noted, and each gameplay section was repeated numerous times and an aggregate of these results was recorded and is what you're seeing on the charts. Kicking things off with an older AAA title in Rise of the Tomb Raider, and the 5500 XT and the RX 580, well, they're neck and neck. The Navi based card returned on average a 97 FPS compared to the Polaris based card 99, while the 1% lows landed in Navi's favour by a solitary unit at 75 compared to 74 on Polaris, pretty much indistinguishable when you're playing. Rise's sequel next, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and this time on the medium preset. And here, the newer Navi architecture, it starts to flex its muscle a little, returning a small but measurable gain over the Polaris based card in terms of average frame rate, 78 FPS compared to 75. The percentile lows here were identical though, both sitting just about the 60 FPS mark. Interestingly though, when bumping the preset up to high, things kinda start to fall apart for the RX 5500 XT as we start to saturate that 4GB frame buffer. The 8GB 580 however has no issues here, and while the performance of the 580 does take a knock by a few frames on this preset, the 5500 XT takes a much larger hit, down to 66 FPS on average, with the lows coming in at 53. Zombie slaying World War Z now, and it's a title which plays well on AMD's hardware, and the optimizations already in place for Polaris, it really shows. The RX 580 storms ahead here with an average of 109 FPS compared to the Navi card's 91, while the percentile lows show a similar gap at 93 compared to the 5500 XT's 79. Metro Exodus however is a game which seems to favour the newer Navi architecture. For this test, I'm going to be using the built-in benchmark. Now this benchmark is interesting in that it is actually a lot more grueling than the actual game is. During this benchmark, both the RX 580 and the 5500 XT dropped to a low of 36 FPS on the high preset with the advanced options turned off. The reality is though that during gunfights, your frame rate is going to be much closer to the average frame rate recorded by the benchmark, and while exploring, your frame rate is going to be much higher than what's shown. Still, during the most taxing sections of the game, a dip to the minimum levels can be seen, although that is on very rare occasions. With that said, the Navi based card returns slightly higher averages at 61 compared to the 580's 57. Far Cry New Dawn is another game which has both cards neck and neck, returning absolutely identical results with an average of 72 FPS and the percentile lows of just a smidge under 60. Now Far Cry is a title which generally underperforms slightly on stock Ryzen CPUs, so to that end I decided to overclock the 1700 to an all-core boost of 3.8 GHz, and while this might seem like a lot compared to the stock 8-core boost on the 1700 of 3.1 GHz, the reality is, in stock form when 2 cores are loaded playing games, it already boosts to 3.7 GHz, and a lot of titles still rely on a couple of stronger threads. In heavily threaded games, or if you're using other applications in the background, this overclock would likely be more noticeable. But here, there was no difference in Metro or either of the Tomb Raider games when the CPU overclock was in place. Now World War Z did see a bump with both the 580 and the 5500 XT. It was to the tune of a couple of FPS though, and with the game already hovering around the 3-figure mark, it's absolutely not noticeable or tangible despite being measurable. Far Cry New Dawn, it was interesting though, as it's a fairly well threaded game, and the additional per core clock speed seen a bump in performance for both cards, finally separating the two. When the CPU is overclocked, the Navi card pulls ahead slightly, returning an average frame rate of 77 compared to 76 on the 580, and the percentile lows are also higher at 63 compared to 61. Again, you're not going to feel that difference, but it is technically there and it is measurable. When it comes to overclocking the 5500 XT, On this Pulse card, there's a few hard limits in place. We can overclock the memory from its stock 14GB per second speeds to just under 15GB per second, and this increased the bandwidth from 224GB per second throughput to 237. And with some power tweaking, I could get the card to settle in north of 1900MHz in game, and that was rock solid over extended play sessions. A rising tide lifts all ships, as they say, and these changes seen about a 5% increase across the board to the 5500 XT performance figures. That said, this 4GB card was still around 5 to 7% short in Shadow of the Tomb Raider at high settings when compared to the 8GB 580, so no amount of clock increases or tweakery will close the gap brought about by that VRAM deficit. When I covered the AMD briefing for the 5500 XT, I said something along the lines of that I hope the pricing is as disruptive for this first gen of Navi as it was during the first gen of Ryzen. And I said that while having the gut feeling that the disruption we all longed for, it wouldn't be realised, and that has borne out to be true here. A 4GB card for 180 quid is, in my opinion, too much, and the £199 price tag for the 8GB version is just not price competitive with similar SKUs of Polaris based cards. At this point, the cards are priced in a way that encourages buyers to gobble up the last of the Polaris stock. It's as simple as that. What I expect to happen though in the months ahead is that both the 4GB and 8GB versions of the 5500 XT will start to drop in price as stock dries up for the older cards. And at that point, this Navi card will simply be the price replacement for the 580. It performs nigh on identically when looking at the whole picture, and using it in the kind of system which it's going to be likely used in. And when pricing starts to get to a level which makes sense, then what you end up with at the end of it is a card with the same performance, at lower noise levels, running cooler, and drawing considerably less power than a Polaris based card. I was seeing around 25 to 30% decrease in power draw from the GPU compared to my 580, and in-game temperatures were also anywhere from 5 to 10 degrees cooler, while the fans were also running at lower RPM. So, it's a hard one, but in my book, the 5500 XT is a decent product at the wrong price. It's not the RX 590 replacement for under 200 quid that I think we all wanted. But it's worth keeping tabs on the market pricing going forward, as at the right price, then this Pulse 5500 XT could be a very tidy looking, cool running and well performing 1080p option for a lot of us out there. But hey, I'm going to leave it there for today folks, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the comments section down below, and in the next video.